Welcome to Beg to Differ, the Bulwark's weekly roundtable discussion featuring civil conversation across the political spectrum, from center left to center right. I'm Mona Charan of the Ethics and Public Policy Center, and I'm joined by our regulars, Bill Galston of the Brookings Institution and the Wall Street Journal, Linda Chavez of the National Immigration Forum and Niskanen, and Damon Linker of The Week. Our special guest this week is Josh Kraushaar of National Journal, and I'm delighted that you are all here. Last week we were down two of our regulars, so welcome back to everybody. And Josh, you are a return guest on Beg to Differ, and we welcome you back.
Well, it's great to be back on the show, Mona.
Okay, so Josh is an election expert. Would you call yourself a pseufologist? Somebody who studies elections? I love that word.
I love the word.
Yeah.
And even though I don't know how to spell it well, but
yeah.
Election analyst, political junkie, any one of those phrases.
All right. So we're at the point in a normal year, in a different world, we would be in the part of the campaign now where the campaigns would be launching their closing arguments. And if we think back to 2016, even though that was completely insane in so many ways, still you could argue that Donald Trump had kind of a closing argument, right? It was drain the swamp. It was lost jobs going to China. It was build the wall. What is his message now? I ask you, Bill Galston.
I join many Republican strategists in scratching my head as to how to answer that question, because I think the standard view is that President Trump so far has failed to develop a closing argument, or at the very least, he has failed to develop an argument to which he can stick consistently for more than a few minutes. And as a result, his effort to tar Joe Biden with one brush or another really hasn't gotten him very far. Biden continues to get very high marks for various aspects of personal character and also presidentiality, just the ability to do the job with competence and dignity. So the president doesn't have a lot of time left unless he can state a clear argument tonight and stick to it every rally and every tweet from now until Election Day. I think his chances of catching up are minimal.
Damon, you had a column this week where you said that you summed up his approach as basically appealing for the jerk vote. Do you want to elaborate on that?
Yeah, that's a line of interpretation I've been developing over the months here in Trump land. Yeah, I mean, it sounds like a joke, but I will say in all seriousness that I do think Trump does have a closing argument, and it is that Joe Biden loves his only surviving son too much. That really does seem to be the consistent message, that his son, not Biden himself, the person running to be president, who served for 2 years as a vice president and was in the Senate for decades, but his surviving son, with the other one having died of cancer in his 40s, this son who has had a rough life, he's been involved in drugs and done sundry other things that have embarrassed Joe Biden and made things difficult. He also did things while Joe Biden was vice president that were probably unseemly, maybe crossed certain lines of ethics that probably should not have happened. And the line seems to be that what Joe Biden should have done is somehow, distance himself, cut him off, repudiate him in some way. And the fact that he hasn't is a sign that Joe Biden too is embroiled and he's a crack addict or something. It's very weak, and it really does risk doing what I think Trump is doing with almost every single thing he and the campaign and its surrogates have been saying for weeks now, which is to play merely to the base of voters who have loved him from the beginning and still love him now. Every single thing is pitched to them and them alone. And most of the rest of the country, I think, listens to this and just thinks, ugh, enough already. I've heard this. You're a terrible person. I don't care what kind of murky stuff could have gone on between Joe Biden and his son, because every 5 minutes you do something worse. So, we're picking between two options and there's no contest. That's how the closing argument seems to be unfolding in my view.
So, Linda, on conservative media, you see the argument that the press is not pushing hard enough on this Biden story. And look, I have to say that there is a grain of a point that they have. I mean, there has been this kind of radio silence about it, and I understand. So I want to ask you how you respond to it, because I completely understand the distaste for this kind of last minute smear, and nobody knows what the facts are, and so on. But that hasn't stopped the press in other situations. So it really does look like mainstream media, obviously not conservative media, but mainstream media have made a decision not to examine the story and not to ask Biden whether that was indeed his son's computer, that kind of thing. What do you say to that?
Well, I think, first of all, that the media does not want to be complicit in what many people believe is, in fact, a Russian op, and that the sudden appearance in the last weeks of the campaign of a laptop hard drive that supposedly was dropped off 3 years ago, and suddenly its contents are available. And I think the media says we're not going to fall for this again. We're not going to give the kind of attention that might amplify this story. But by the way, if you spend any time on conservative media, as I do, as I feel a duty to do, if you watch Fox News, if you do what I did yesterday, which was to watch an interview with Rudy Giuliani on Newsmax, the detail that they are giving now, the argument that they are making, is not just that Hunter Biden has done some nefarious things. What is being said right now by Rudy Giuliani is that Vice President Biden received money, whether it was 10% or 50%, apparently it varied in terms of the money that was given to Biden. This was all given then by Hunter to his father, and that Biden himself was part of this scheme, is so outrageous, so over the top, and so without any supporting information. The FBI, after all, has a copy of this hard drive. The police were notified, according to Giuliani, of some of the pictures that were found that may have involved underage girls. And no law enforcement agency has done anything, which gives you to believe that this is made up, that it is distrusted. And I think the media is right not to amplify this message, because this is the most outrageous kind of accusation about a man who simply has no history of corruption. I mean, this is not a rich guy. This isn't a guy who, like Donald Trump, has places, gold-plated toilets, etc. There's just no indication that any of this happened. So I think the media is playing it right.
Well, Josh, in 2016, to look back again just a bit, Trump, at the very end, the last 2 to 3 weeks, if I'm recalling correctly, he got himself a little bit under control. He stopped tweeting so much. He acted well. He took himself out of the limelight a little bit, which may have been a key thing in getting him across the finish line successfully. So this week we have seen him fighting with Leslie Stahl, stalking off the 60 Minutes set, fighting with Anthony Fauci, threatening to fire his second FBI Director Christopher Wray, threatening his attorney general if he doesn't bring charges against his political opponent. So, so what do you, first of all, how does that strike you? Does it strike you that there just isn't anybody anymore who can tell him to change his tone? And second, what do you think it portends about tonight's debate, if anything?
Well, Mona, one of the most consistent patterns throughout the Trump campaign and the Trump presidency is that when Trump is out of the spotlight for a few days, his numbers go up. When he's in the spotlight, fighting with media personalities, fighting with debate moderators, airing out his feuds on Twitter, that's when his numbers tick down a little bit. So, and we saw that during the end of the 2016 campaign, when after the Access Hollywood video came out and the Comey, emails came out, he actually that final week was very much focused on message, under the radar enough to help win the election by those narrow margins in the Midwest. And as you noted, Mona, he's spending this week fighting with Leslie Stahl, fighting with Kristen Welker, talking about issues that appeal to his grievances, but he's not talking about Amy Coney Barrett's pending confirmation to the Supreme Court all that much. He's not talking about the stimulus that could pass either before the election, maybe after the election, that seems to be coming together at this late stage. I mean, that would actually help him politically if he managed to show an ounce of self-discipline. There are a lot of voters that don't like Trump, but like his policies generally, like the administration's instincts on foreign policy, economic policy. So he's only undermining himself. And no, I don't think he's going to show that discipline at this debate. By all accounts, he hasn't even practiced. He hasn't even spent an hour in practice to come up with a message, to come up with a few talking points against Joe Biden tonight. So he's his own worst enemy. He's not listening to advice. And there really aren't a lot of adults in the room that are giving him good advice these days. So, yeah, I mean, I am the biggest difference between 2016 was that he was the insurgent, and it's easy to run against something, especially when you're running a campaign like the president did 4 years ago. When you're the incumbent, you have to run on your record, and his message touting his own accomplishments has been all over the map and very poorly handled.
Well, and he doesn't actually talk about his accomplishments much. I mean, he mostly focuses on his grievances and his victimhood and how unfair people are being to him. But since you mentioned Amy Coney Barrett, Josh, I'd like your views on how this has played out. Not that she's going to get confirmed. That was pretty clear from the beginning, but rather the change in public opinion. At first, there was a dramatic majority of people who said that the seat should be held open and that the next president should get the opportunity to appoint. And then after her confirmation hearings, where she acquitted herself very well, now apparently a majority, it may be not quite a majority, but a large number, maybe a majority, want her to be confirmed. And I'm wondering, what about all those people who are very concerned about what the fate, say, of Roe v. Wade and so on? Are they now does that really not bother that many people? How do you interpret the fact that most people say she should be confirmed now?
Yeah, we tend to assume that voters are much more ideological than they actually are. And, ultimately, a lot of voters, even those who are, Democrats or liberal minded, tend to judge things on the merits. And for those who've caught a little bit or saw some sound bites from that 2-day hearing or the 3-day hearing in the Senate Judiciary Committee, I mean, Judge Amy Coney Barrett was clearly qualified, clearly experienced, had a judicial temperament. You couldn't come away from looking at her performance and just from a strictly human level think that she wasn't qualified to be on the Supreme Court. And, there's been poll after poll. It's not just one pollster, but Gallup, Morning Consult, the New York Times, Siena poll, all have shown her favorability numbers skyrocketing to the point where there's pluralities or majorities that actually want her to be seated, including a decent minority of Democrats in those polls. So, look, Trump is not helping himself by not talking as much about his own pick for the Supreme Court. I don't think it would have a huge impact if he was a little, on message a little more in the final couple weeks. But this is one of the appointment of judges, 3 Supreme Court justices in all likelihood, if she gets confirmed. That's one of his biggest accomplishments, and he's barely talking about it, both at his rallies and also in these interviews.
Yeah, I think what you say is true, that the voters are not nearly as ideological as we think, and certainly I keep butting my head up against this reality, and I find it very hard to assimilate. But it seems to be true that people aren't all that exercised about the issues. Damon, did you have something to add to that?
Yeah, just a brief point that I think I made on the podcast several weeks ago, right after uh, Justice Ginsburg died, which is that I do think the track record and the polling bears out that Democrats simply are, as a whole, not as energized about the Supreme Court as Republicans are. I think it is simply not the case that if the situation were completely reversed and you had an Antonin Scalia dying in October with a Democratic president and a Democratic Senate, that the Republican side would simply be going, oh, well, after a few weeks. They would be energized. They would be talking about it constantly. The polls would show that Republican voters were furious about this. And I'm not weighing in on the relative justice or injustice of what the Republicans are doing with Barrett right now, but simply pointing out that you see it in who talks and what they talk about at the conventions, that at the Republican convention, the Supreme Court is something that people care about. It doesn't come up much at the Democratic convention, and it didn't 4 years ago when we had just lived through the whole Merrick Garland situation, where, Obama's running for re-election and a justice dies in February, and he's denied his candidate getting hearings or a vote. So I do think there is a difference. It's of course true in general that voters are less ideological than people like us who are talking and listening to this podcast. But it does differ from issue to issue.
Right. Bill Galston, you wanted to add something?
Yeah, just very briefly. I agree with Damon's snapshot of where things are now. But imagine where things would be in a few years if the new Supreme Court takes a good hard run at Roe v. Wade and may not formally overturn it, but could come close to neutering it. I would predict that Democrats would suddenly become much more aroused by Supreme Court issues than they are now. And Republicans, I think it's fair to say, and especially cultural conservatives, have had a long run of Supreme Court decisions that they view as fundamentally hostile to their understanding of the country and of morality. If the shoe shifts, I think the dynamic within the Democratic Party will do so as well.
Let me just add that, yes, the conservatives and Republicans see the court as hostile to their interests, but they see it actually in an even more narrow way than you're describing, I think, Bill, because they feel that the court could endanger their religious liberty. So they're worried that the court could say that, for example, if you have a rule in your church that the only married couples that you recognize are male-female couples, that organization could then be declared to be a hate group and not be eligible for tax deductible tax treatment. So that's part of what they are, why they are so exercised. Linda, did you want to add?
Well, I do think that Republicans are much more focused and ideological than Democrats are on these issues. But I also think it's interesting that Biden has to date resisted the effort to expand the court, which is often referred to as packing the court. But now he's announced just on the eve of the debate that he would, in fact, have a commission set up that would look at the issue of courts. And it isn't just the Supreme Court that President Trump has had an enormous effect on. It's the lower courts. I mean, he has an almost unprecedented number of appointments that he's been been able to make. And those, of course, are very important. And I agree with Bill that if you were to see a turnaround, particularly on Roe, because that is something that I think a lot of Democrats in particular feel affects them personally, affects their right to make a choice about whether to bring a child into the world, that you would see a similar kind of reaction.
Well, I will just, if I've already said this on this podcast, I apologize for repeating myself, but it does strike me that there may be parallels to the situation in 1937 when Franklin Roosevelt attempted to pack the court, and because the conservative justices were striking down New Deal legislation. And in the midst of this great controversy, one of the justices changed his position and voted for New Deal legislation, and it has come down to us in history as the switch in time that saved 9. And it is quite possible, it seems to me, that there could be one or two of the justices who are thought to be in the 6-vote majority for overturning Roe v. Wade who might shy away from it exactly because they recognize that it would be so disruptive. So I'm not predicting that. I'm just saying it's entirely possible and it has historical precedent. All right, let's move on now to trying to tease out what we can understand from the polls. Now, some people say that for your mental health, you shouldn't look at polls at all the next 2 weeks. And our friend Mike Murphy, for example, says, well, if you have to, just look every other day, don't make yourself nuts. But here on this podcast, we do it so you don't have to. And I know, Bill, you follow this closely. Gallup has a new figure out today. 56% say Trump doesn't deserve re-election. Do you want to talk about the difference between national polls and the state battleground polls? I mean, everybody knows the difference, but those battlegrounds, I was looking at them this morning, a number of them are within the margin of error.
Well, yes, but I posted a piece to the Brookings website earlier this week, which came to a conclusion that surprised me because I didn't expect it in advance. I compared where things stand right now with the large number of swing states to where they stood after the election in 2016 when reliable data became available. And it turns out that although the swing states are, for the most part, closer than the national averages, they have all changed from their 2016 result by roughly the same percentage point. And so a sign of that is that a state where Donald Trump ran 8 points ahead in 2016 is now just about even. And if you compare that to where Biden stands right now, he has about a 10-point lead. The Quinnipiac poll that was issued as we were talking put it at exactly 10. Several other polls have put it in roughly the same zone during the past 48 hours. Biden is running 8 points ahead of where Hillary Clinton did. And so, yes, the swing states are more competitive, but you can calculate with a high degree of reliability, I think, which states would shift from the Biden column to the Trump column if Trump succeeds in cutting the national vote margin by a certain percent. And my conclusion is that not all that much has changed since 2016. If Trump can narrow it to the 2016 result of 2 points, he will get the same result as he did in 2016 in the Electoral College and might carry Nevada as well. If he loses the national popular vote by 4 points or more, he will lose the Electoral College. And that leaves a zone of indeterminacy, which I call the nightmare scenario, the 3% scenario, where a lot of states that matter, including Pennsylvania, would be right on the cusp. That's the one I don't want to think about because it would guarantee an extraordinarily messy uh, post election legal and political wrangle.
Josh, one of the things that Trump partisans talk about is they don't have too much good news to focus on, but one thing they do stress is that Republican voter registration is up. And there are some people who are hostile to Trump's reelection who say, well, that may be true, but we shouldn't worry about it too much. And what's your view? I mean, do the Trump people have a sort of magic wand for conjuring more rural white voters out of the woodwork?
Well, I think it's important to contextualize the gains Republicans have made registration wise in some of the big battleground states, because it covers the time period of February to now, pretty much overlapping with the pandemic. And one thing we know about Democratic behavior during the pandemic, and most people, frankly, but certainly Democrats, didn't go out, didn't go door knocking, didn't go door to door to register
That's
voters.
interesting. Yeah.
So if you actually compare the Republican to Republican year to year advantages, I don't think it's that notable. It's just that Democrats haven't registered new voters, which is significant. They haven't been able to build their base. They haven't been able to register new voters in these very important states. But I think a lot of people have been overreading those numbers simply because the data period of time where that data was collected is a time when Democrats just were not trying to register voters in person. So I would much rather look at the polling, both public polling and certainly, as Bill was attesting to, I've talked to Republicans polling House and Senate races. They really have a lot of money in the game and know where things stand. And they have the president running about 8 points behind, even in some of the redder districts and states where he was in 2016. So, I mean, I think that's a much more fundamental reflection of where this race stands. I think the president, he has a debate to turn things around. It's a last big moment in this campaign. But when you look at both the polling and also some of these micro trends, these demographic trends, most notably with seniors, seniors were part of Trump's base in 2016. He carried the senior 65 plus vote by 7 points nationally in the exit poll 4 years ago. He's now losing seniors in almost every poll, and sometimes by sizable margins, depending on what poll you're looking at. And seniors they vote.
Yeah.
they are very concerned about the pandemic, and Trump is not helping himself by his blasé dismissiveness towards the public health situation. So, states like Florida, Arizona, Iowa, even Ohio, among others. I mean, those are states where Trump did very well with seniors, and the numbers have dramatically shifted since 2016.
Do you think there's any use in looking at things like voter enthusiasm? Do you think it leads you astray to look at early voting trends this year, since everything is so, strange this year with the virus and everything else?
I do. I mean, one thing I've learned from the last 3 elections is that almost everyone, even the smartest people who have made predictions on early voting trends, have been badly wrong and mistaken.
Right.
And the biggest mistake is that they've kind of extrapolated. They assume the high early vote numbers suggest, huge record-setting enthusiasm, and we may very well see record enthusiasm and turnout in this election. But what ended up happening in 2016, for example, is that a lot of Democrats, instead of voting on election day, they just voted early. And
Right.
a lot of Florida, North Carolina, a lot of analysts thought that meant there was this record-setting Democratic turnout. But what happened in 2016 is that Florida and North Carolina initially looked favorable for Hillary Clinton, but then they cannibalized all that vote from the election day vote. And
Sure.
it turned out that when we counted the election day vote on election night, that was a very Republican electorate in every part of the state, in those states. So
Right. And we have
I would hesitate to draw too many conclusions. I'm hearing mixed things from both parties about the nature of the early vote. I do think it's good. There's going to be record turnout. I just don't know. I think the more important question is how enthusiastic is the Republican vote. That's the big X factor.
Right. And we also have the polling that says that significant percentages of Biden voters plan to vote, either already have voted or plan to vote early or mail in. And almost the same percentage, a large percentage of Trump voters plan to show up on Election Day. So probably not wise to get too far ahead of ourselves here. Bill, you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with Josh. I would say that there are all sorts of indications in the survey research that there is enormous enthusiasm on both sides. And it's a mistake just to look at the enthusiasm for Biden versus enthusiasm for Trump numbers, although Biden's numbers on enthusiasm have ticked up considerably in the past couple of weeks, because I can guarantee you that the Democrats who aren't enthusiastic about voting for Joe Biden are really enthusiastic about voting against Donald Trump. And that, to the extent which is near total, that this election is about Trump, I think there is little to choose between the two political parties in point of enthusiasm. As for early voting, I think you and Josh are absolutely right that drawing any linear inferences from early voting is a mistake and has been in the past. This said, as of 1:54 this afternoon, 47 million Americans had already voted. That's almost 1/3 of the total number of votes cast in 2016. Of course, there's a lot of cannibalizing of election day voting going on, but I find it hard to look at those numbers and not to frame some hypotheses about the turnout that we're likely to see. I wouldn't be surprised to see it back to the level of the Obama 2008 campaign, if not higher.
Linda, you wanted to add something.
Well, I hope that Bill and Josh and others are right. I sort of view polls like I do the scale. You're told never to weigh yourself every day. Well, don't want to look at the polls every day. But on the other hand, if you don't look at them every day, just as not getting on the scale every day, you could find yourself in a whole heck of a lot of trouble. And I have to say, I am very concerned about the enthusiasm of Trump voters. And, it's obviously anecdotal. It's not based on polling data, which goes in exactly the opposite way. But in sort of surveying my circle of friends or former friends who voted for Trump, I haven't found a single one in my actual acquaintance that's changed their mind. And in fact, I just found out a day or two ago about a very close friend who said that he wrote in the Libertarian candidate in 2016, but this time he's going to hold his nose and vote for Trump. So I'm worried. Those rallies, while they turn a lot of people off, they also turn a lot of people on. And I'm just, I'm not going to breathe easy until about a week after the election is over. And maybe then I'll believe whatever the results are.
Damon?
The only thing I can add is that, I share the anxieties while also sharing the general sense that Biden is winning. But it is important to keep in mind when, you're unsure which way it's going to go, to recall that the situation for the last 4 years has been unbelievably constant when it comes to public opinion polling. You look at 538's tracking poll of approval. From the third week of Trump's presidency, he has been about 10 points underwater every single time, every day. It has never changed. If you go to 538, which has this great tracking poll of Trump versus Biden going way back over a year. Last October on this date, Biden was winning by 7 Today, according to this, he's winning by 7.9. In November a year ago, so 11 months ago, Biden was up a little more. Then it was more like 10 points. This has not changed. So I agree that there are some Americans who just want Trump and are excited by him and want to vote for him. But unless there is a systematic error across just about every poll, there are simply more Americans who detest him. And that is going to be the reality, and it's going to really come down to turnout. Do the Democrats hate Trump as much as Republicans love Trump? And if everyone shows up who answers these polls this way, it's pretty clear what the outcome should be. But we shall see.
At the risk of sounding optimistic, because I'm nervous too, and I agree with what you're all saying and what Linda said about not being ready to rest easy until it's really in the bag. But I will just point out a couple of other little data. One is that there were third-party candidates who polled a lot of votes in 2016. If Hillary Clinton had only won the votes that went for Jill Stein, for example, she would have been president. This year, there's a very hardly known at all third-party candidate from the Libertarian Party who isn't picking up that much. And if you look at the polling data, you find that voters who chose a third party or didn't vote in 2016 are backing Biden by a 10-point margin. So that's encouraging. And then, of course, there's the old chestnut that a president in a reelect, if he's not above 50%, if he's not at 50% or above, he tends to lose. So there's that. And I don't believe, Josh, you correct me if I'm wrong, I don't believe Trump has ever been above 50% approval, has he?
That's right. He's never hit 50% in any poll, any reputable poll, I should say, since he was elected. Though I will say that for President Trump, a point or two of gain in job approval is sort of the equivalent of 10 points for any normal president, because his numbers don't move a whole lot, as we've been discussing. So, like, if all the president needs to do is gain a point or two, and the Senate could end up, being much more favorable, much more likely to remain under Republican control, and he could get back get back to contention in some of these battleground states if he just jumps a couple points in the poll. So, even though his numbers don't move a whole lot, 2 points in a job approval for President Trump can mean the difference between a close race and a blowout.
Maybe he should try to get impeached again, because that improved his standing.
Mona, could I just ask our data guys a question? And that is the question about whether or not you're better off today than you were 4 years ago. And apparently there is some polling data that suggests that people, despite a pandemic and everything else, feel better off today. I know this is one of the things that Trump likes to tout. Anybody have an explanation of that?
I think it may have a little bit to do with the economy. I mean, that's the one strength, generally speaking, that the president has in his poll numbers. And I think a lot of people were expecting an even worse economic depression, an even deeper hole than we are right now. So, I mean, I think some of that may reflect a feeling among some voters that things aren't as bad as perhaps they worried about when the pandemic first started.
Okay. Josh, can we just spend just a minute on how you will be spending election night? What are the telltale states, districts, races that you think are the ones to watch and will be the most revealing about how the thing is going?
Well, the state. Let me start out with the state map, because Florida is going to be one of the states that reports most of the results early on election night. And if Joe Biden wins, if the race is called for Joe Biden in Florida, that it's almost impossible for President Trump to win the election.
Can I interrupt real quick? Is it the case that Florida counts its absentee ballots before Election Day?
I believe so. I know that unlike some states,
Yeah. Okay.
they're not waiting until after the election to count ballots.
Okay.
So that's the case.
Good. Okay.
And they've had an early voting system in place for many years, so
Yeah.
they haven't had to rejigger their system to accommodate for the pandemic all that much. So I'm looking at Florida very closely. As far as the Senate races, I mean, so I think Florida is going to be the one state everyone's focused on. My colleague at the Cook Political Report, Dave Wasserman, has actually pointed to the precinct where the Village is, the retirement community is, as a huge bellwether. It's a Republican area, but if it's not quite as Republican, Sumter County is not quite as Republican this time around, it's a big, big sign that Trump is in trouble throughout the country. As far as Senate races, I would point to the Iowa Senate race between Joni Ernst, the freshman senator, and Teresa Greenfield, the Democrat, which looks like it may be headed in a slightly Democratic direction, which is pretty remarkable for a state that gave Trump a 9-point margin in 2016. And also North Carolina with the sex scandal of the Democratic challenger, Cal Cunningham. That race is getting very close, and that's going to be one of the more competitive Senate races on the map.
Okay, I'm sorry. I said that was my last question on this topic, but I can't resist. Do you think it's crazy that the Alaska Senate race could go to the Democrat?
It's not crazy. I view Alaska in the same way I view some of these more Republican states that are being talked about, like Kansas and South Carolina. If you look at the polling closely enough, there are Republicans that haven't fully come home to the party. And I think in the end, Republicans should hold on to those pretty darn Republican seats, including the Alaska one.
Right. Okay. Let us now turn to a story that I find immensely upsetting, but it's in the news this week, and I think it's important to address it. I hope that these kinds of things we won't be seeing so much of. But it's been reported now that 545 of the children who were separated from their parents at the southern border have never been reunited with their families, and that about 60 of the children were under the age of 5 when they were separated. So, Linda, I'm going to turn to you as our resident immigration expert. First of all, is there any precedent for this sort of thing?
No, I don't think there is. I mean, this is the most appalling failure of government. Apart from the humanitarian scandal, that they could not even gather information, put that information in a form that could be kept and shared between agencies, and that they would not be sure to follow through is just incompetence at the very, very highest level. You know, we keep hearing about QAnon and the Save the Children campaign. Well, if there is a cabal out there kidnapping children, maybe they ought to look to President Trump not as the savior, but as the person who's actually done it. And, there's 500 kids now who have been taken away from their parents. And it's just, it's so scandalous. And it falls, by the way, right after we learned of an internal report from the Justice Department that made it clear that punishing parents, that using children as a way to harass people was in fact the very driving force behind the zero tolerance policy. They wanted to make sure that people in Central America got the picture that if they dare cross the border with a child in tow, that child was going to be taken from them. And apparently now, at least for hundreds of them, not only not returned, but they've lost track of who the parents are. They don't even know how to get a hold of the parents.
Yeah, and Bill, some humanitarian groups and others have been attempting to find the parents, but of course, one of the things that intervened was COVID, and many of them are in Central America, in remote areas where it's hard to get to, and it's kind of it's a nightmare. I'm just going to read you a quote from our former Attorney General, who we tend to think of sort of sympathetically because he was so much of a target for Trump, because he did the ethical thing in recusing himself from the Russia investigation, but on this subject, he was just appalling. He said, according to that internal report that Linda was mentioning, I'm pretty sure he also said this publicly at the time. We need to take away children, Sessions told the prosecutors. If they care about kids, don't bring them in. Won't give amnesty to people with kids.
What is one to say, Mona? Moral blindness of a very profound kind. This, and let me be a little bit more precise about that. The argument appears to be that if the end is arguably worthy, then any and all means are permissible in pursuit of that end. I am not the first to point out that kind of instrumental reasoning leads in very, very dangerous directions.
Absolutely.
And here we are. There's an old, almost hackneyed phrase that such and so an act shocks the conscience. Well, I don't think that phrase is over the top in describing this particular policy. If it had simply been incompetence, it would have been culpable, but culpable in a different way. But it's not incompetence. It's indifference, moral indifference to the distinction between permitted and forbidden means in pursuit of political ends. And for that, I think the people who executed this policy, conceived this policy, condoned this policy, are going to be condemned in the light of history. I really do. This is the moral low point of an administration that does not lack for moral low points.
Damon, I think Bill makes an excellent point about means and ends. Sometimes that line can get murky. After 9/11, we all, sort of struggled through discussions about what we would do in a ticking time bomb situation if we thought we were in, possession of a terrorist who knew that there was a dirty bomb in the middle of Manhattan somewhere. Do you resort to torture? That kind of thought experiment, means and ends. The end is obviously very, very good there, and the means are disgusting, but maybe okay. So that it's not an absolutely easy issue, but in this case, it's pretty simple. If your goal is to cut down on illegal immigration, separating nursing mothers from their infants does not seem to meet means and ends.
No, I don't even really know what to say about it. So I guess I will cede my comment to our friend Sarah Longwell, who had, I thought, the best pithy tweet in response to this when the story broke a couple nights ago about the 545 migrant children separated by the Trump administration and how their families can't be found. She just tweeted, "When an administration is both morally bankrupt and incompetent." And that really is just all that needs to be said. I mean, it is just beyond. It is the kind of perfect storm of awfulness of everything this administration stands for. And I agree with Bill. I don't often make references to, you're on the right side of history or wrong side of history. I don't really think history has sides, but I do think that it's pretty clear that there aren't going to be a lot of people around looking back at that episode and saying, well, they really had to protect the country from those migrants coming in. So we had to steal the children and raise them as orphans and send their parents back without them and then couldn't figure it out. I mean, it's just so appalling. I have nothing more to say.
So, Josh, of course, they have their excuses. They say, or at least I'm not talking about the officials here. I'm talking about sort of people on the right who are defending this. Their little fantasy that they've spun goes as follows. These weren't really their children. These were human traffickers using these children to get into the United States. And we were the heroes here by removing these children from people who were not actually their parents. So I'm not going to ask you to respond to that because it's obviously invented. I mean, there might have been one or two cases like that, but not thousands. But I want to ask a different question, because one of the things that's been so disheartening about this whole era is that we don't have debates anymore about issues like immigration. We have dueling, well, much of it coming from the right, just false narratives, ginned up to appeal to people's emotions, to their gonads, and real argument gets swallowed up. I mean, I would love to have a debate. I mean, look, it's not a simple question, right? What you do when thousands of people are trying to claim asylum and whole families are coming to the border. I mean, that's a hard problem. But I wonder whether we have lost the capacity to even have debates and reasonable discussions.
I'm pessimistic in the short term. I'm a little more optimistic in the medium term. I mean, in politics and with this administration, certainly, the fish rots from the head, and the president sets the tone and the mood of the party. And certainly, Trump has infected his views, his temperament, his lack of empathy with almost every Republican office holder, whether they say so publicly or tortured privately as a result of what's happened these last few years. But if you look at the polling, even among Republicans in these last couple of years, and like immigration, hardline immigration policy is not politically popular. In fact, it's lost a lot of support, the hardline position that this administration has taken, largely because President Trump, an unpopular President Trump, has been associated with it. A lot of the policies that are connected to this lack of empathy, lack of compassion, have lost favor as Trump has been associated with failures governmentally and just chaos across the country. So I'm one of the, I think I'm in the minority generally, but if Trump loses a decisive reelection campaign and loses in states like Georgia or even Texas that have never been competitive for a long time for Democrats, Republicans, for their own survival, are going to need to recognize that this is not the way forward. You're not going to be able to win back power by behaving like the president. And sure, he may be on Twitter. Sure, he may have a lot of people who follow him. But I actually kind of think that we've hit rock bottom, and there are a lot of problems with social media, a lot of problems with discourse, and I don't see a magic wand changing these institutional failures and institutional problems. But I also think that Trump is sort of the straw that stirs the drink of the party and certainly of the moment. And if he does lose convincingly, I think that Republicans are going to engage in a civil war, a reckoning of sorts, and it may not happen overnight. But I think the party knows that for its own survival, they can't continue on this course.
Well, as the old saying goes, from your lips to God's ears. Let's hope that that's what happens. All right, let us now turn to our final segment where we highlight or lowlight something for our listeners. Linda Chavez.
Well, I was going to just recommend the Borat movie, which is coming out tomorrow, but I think I'll be a little more serious than that. I am planning on watching it, by the way. It's a little comic relief from what's going on. But I think there was an important story that I think it deserves a lot more attention. It was in the New York Times, and it says, Europe wonders if it can rely on U.S. again, whoever wins. And I think this is one of the great challenges of the next administration. And even if it is Biden, who obviously has a lot of personal respect among leaders, but we've become a rather unreliable ally in recent years. And the fact that we abandon our friends, we've abandoned the people who fought alongside us in our wars, I think this is going to be a big problem. And I think it's going to be the single most serious foreign policy problem that a new president faces.
And by the way, it is kind of encouraging that Biden has stated this as one of his objectives, as restoring our relationship with our allies.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Okay, Bill Galston.
Well, believe it or not, Linda took away my point.
About Borat?
But I'm glad that I'm glad that the famous Mona Linda mind meld is now getting a third participant. So I'll make a really obscure point about bellwethers to look at. Since 1944, a little county in Ohio, Ottawa County, has gotten it right every time for 19 consecutive presidential elections. It happens to be the county where the distinguished political scientist and sociologist Robert Putnam was born, someone who really has his finger on the pulse of America about as well as anybody. And so the question is, will the 20th time break the streak? If not, it's certainly something. It is certainly a county to watch because it has one of the longest streaks of getting it right at the presidential level in all of the 3,000 plus counties in the United States.
Damon.
Well, we've spent a lot of time over the last several years talking about the Trump era as one of racial polarization, because, well, for one thing, our president is a giant racist, and he loves to kind of weaponize racial tensions for his own political benefit. And that's all true. But one thing that it hasn't gotten as much play is that there is also in our politics a growing and very large gender divide. And there's an excellent piece in New York Magazine a couple days ago by Eric Levitz titled "Men and Women Have Never Been More Politically Divided." There's some good data in there and very interesting parallels, over time in this country as well as internationally on this issue. And I suspect in the coming electoral cycles, this gap is going to play a larger and larger role in our politics. So it's well worth reading and pondering.
Josh.
Well, I want to talk about another bellwether of sorts, a race that is unusually close, surprisingly close, and one that could signal a Republican blowout, a Democratic landslide, I should say, in November. And that's Mark Meadows' old House seat in Western North Carolina, covering Asheville and the Blue Ridge and the mountains out there. Polling from both Republicans and Democrats suggests that the Republican nominee, a 25-year-old candidate by the name of Madison Cawthorn, who spoke at the Republican convention, is at risk of losing to a Democratic national security expert. And that would be a district that Trump almost carried by 20 points in the 2016 election. It's Mark Meadows' House seat. It is the heart of conservative North Carolina. And North Carolina will be counting ballots probably earlier than most of those East Coast states. And if Mark Meadows, the chief of staff to President Trump, loses if he sees the Democrats flip his old House seat early in the night on election night, not only will it be a sign that this is a big blue wave coming, but it will be an extraordinary embarrassment to the chief of staff and to the Trump administration.
Excellent. Thank you. All right. Mine is, I would like to recommend a piece by my dear friend and former podcasting partner, Jay Nordlinger. He wrote a piece in National Review this week called Trump and Dictators. And it is a, survey of the entire literature and it's quite a lot of it, by the way, of Trump's views on dictators and authoritarians of various kinds, his embrace of cruelty and sheer power, and his willingness to praise killers. So it's an important historical document. I mean, I think you should download it and put it in your files for the days when people say that we are exaggerating how bad Trump was. All right. Thank you, one and all. Josh, thanks so much for coming back, sharing your wisdom. It's good to have the team all back together. And we will return next week as every week. Thank you.